Hello and welcome to part 2 of my daily 486 build series, where I'm basically putting together a gaming system for my own personal day-to-day use. So be sure to check out part 1 where I took an in-depth look at all the parts I selected and also my goals for the build. So I got a bit sidetracked working on some other things the last couple of weeks, so I'm a bit further behind than I hoped, but not to worry, I will get this build finished. I promised myself I'd get this thing built and I'm going to hold myself to it. But I must say it has not been easy. You have no idea how hard I've been fighting the urge to change my direction on this build. I found some new AT cases, some new CPUs, cool new 486 board, some faster RAM, and I even got another MediaVision card. So man, I can be super indecisive about these things, and I think it really all just comes down to how much I love the retro hardware. But honestly, my desire to get this build just right is doomed to failure from the start, I think. There really is no such thing as a perfect retro build. And there's always going to be pros and cons for anything I decide on, whether it be the CPU, the board, the sound card, you name it. I don't know what it is really. When you're building something for your own personal use, it feels a bit more permanent than when you're putting something on the test bench. And I keep reminding myself too, my promise was really to put together a machine that'll remain built and that I could use day to day for gaming and other retro purposes. But that doesn't mean I can't swap out some parts in the future if I'm not happy with something. So all these cool new acquisitions, I'm going to use them for future projects and other purposes, but really I have to start somewhere. And I think that the parts I chose are still going to be awesome and are a really good choice. I made a few minor changes since the first video, but overall I'm going to stick with the plan. So as you can see here, I've got the build sort of half assembled on my test bench. As tempting as it is to just sort of throw it into a case right now, I'm going to start building it this way because I've still got a lot of tweaking and tuning to do, and I'll be swapping CPUs, changing jumpers, and things like that. And it's just way easier to do this outside of the case for now. So once I've decided on the CPU I'll be using for the build, and once I've got the system up and running exactly the way I want it, then I'll get it together in the case and do the cabling and everything like that. So I'll have most of the components in place, at least on the test bench, to make sure the system's working as I intend to build it. About the only thing that won't be hooked up for these first tests I'm going to do here is the SCSI CD-ROM drive and the real 1.44 meg floppy drive. Even though I haven't chosen a CPU yet, I really need to see what this system is capable of. And unlike modern systems these days, there's potentially a lot of performance that could be gained through, some basic tweaks like tighter timing, some BIOS settings, lowering wait states, even doing some VESA local bus tweaks. So back in the day, manufacturer defaults were tuned a lot more for stability and not performance. I think there was a lot more variation in the quality of components, and things didn't really have the tight, standards that we deal with today. So I don't want to leave performance on the table, and on the flip side too, I don't want to go too overboard and have to deal with a system that's crashing all the time. So it's going to be very important that I go through this whole process here. So to do this first round of tweaking, obviously I have to pick a CPU. So I just went with the fastest candidate that I'm considering for the build, and that's the Intel DX4 100. Once I've got the system well tuned, I'll start testing the individual CPUs. So unfortunately in my initial testing, I was hoping to try out this Cyrix DX280 CPU that runs at a 40 megahertz frontside bus. And for whatever reason, I don't know what's going on with this chip, but it did sort of work just fine initially. And I found that, there was a little bit of instability at times, and then it sort of got progressively worse to the point where now I can't even get into DOS at all with this chip. So I think it's either defective or the 3.45 volts that my board provides just isn't enough for stability on this. So I think this chip is going to be out. I'm going to, save it for one of my boards that does support full 4 volts, and I'll maybe try it out later. But rather than just pit two CPUs up against each other, I wanted to sort of expand my search a little bit. So I did want to include two CPUs I did exclude originally, but I'm going to include now. So this again is the DX280 from AMD. It is a 5 volt part, which I'm not too keen on, but I'm going to try it out and see how it does. If I do like it, it is really easy to find 3 volt versions of this on eBay and other places, so maybe I'll pick one up if I do like this one. But I really did want to get something in the running with a 40 megahertz frontside bus. I think that will make for a very interesting build. I also want to include this chip too. It may be a little slower than what I'm hoping for this build, but the DX266 really is a legendary CPU, especially one from Intel. This one here is an overdrive variant, but very similar to what you'd find in the ceramic top. There's really no difference at all. So I'm going to try this one out as well, and I think it's also a good reference point to see how fast the other chips compare to this, which is sort of the gold standard of 486s in my opinion, so I'm happy to have this in the running as well. And another one I'm going to include some results for. I'm not planning to use this one for the build, but if you check in the description of the video, you'll find a link to the overclocking build-off video I did with this same board. And I did run this AMD Am5x86 P75, which is a 133 megahertz part through its paces. So I'm going to include the results for that in the comparison. So it'd be interesting to see, you know, sort of the gold standard DX2 versus pretty much the fastest 486 as well, and the other chips will be somewhere in between. The other thing I'm going to change here is the RAM that I'm using in the system. So I had 70 nanosecond stuff in there before, which, you know, is just fine if you're running a 33 megahertz frontside bus. But because I want to include DX280s in this running with a 40 megahertz bus, you really do need 60 nanosecond RAM in order to do the full tweaking and get the weight states low. All right, so let's get this system powered up here. So I've got a basic AT to ATX power adapter here, and I've got the two wires that are used for power on shorted. So as soon as I flip the power switch on the power supply itself, the system will power up. I'm going to leave absolutely everything in the BIOS at their default values and auto settings, aside from just setting the hard drive and that sort of thing. So let's see how the system benchmarks right out of the box like this. So the first benchmark I'm going to run is Doom. Doom is an important one to me because, number one, it's a game I actually play, but it's also a very, very good benchmark to check the overall system performance. The VGA performance is important for it to score well, but so is the CPU and memory and things like that. So if you make improvements to your system speed, chances are it will show up in Doom here. So let's see how it does. So it looks like we got about 27.2 frames per second. So not bad, but really not great either. So the next benchmark I'm going to run is the System Information CPU benchmark. And this benchmark is purely synthetic. It is basically a measure of CPU performance. Your L2 cache does play a little bit of a role here, but your main memory really doesn't. So this CPU scores 132, which seems just a little bit low for a DX4. So the next benchmark I'm going to run is called Cache Check, and this tool basically gives you your access time or latency figures for your various cache levels, including your main memory, and at the end of the test it'll give you your throughput values as well. So you can see here that we're getting pretty good numbers for the L1 cache at 10 or 11 nanoseconds, the L2 is at 28 nanoseconds, but the main memory is really, really slow at about 115 to 120 nanoseconds. And you can see the throughput numbers at the bottom. The L1 looks great at over 100 megs per second, but the main memory, you know, we're not even getting 10 megs per second, so there's definitely a lot of room for improvement there, I think. So next we're going to run 3D Bench 1.0C. It's another 320 by 200 VGA benchmark and gives some indication of the system's gaming performance. So it's running pretty smooth here, and looks like we got almost 50 frames per second, which in most cases for a 486 is not bad, but I certainly would expect a bit better from a DX4 system. And last but not least, we'll run SpeedSys. So SpeedSys is a very popular benchmarking tool, and it checks a few things on your system. It'll give you a processor benchmark. You'll get some memory bandwidth values for your various cache levels and your main memory. And there's also some hard drive tests it can do as well. So you can see here that we scored 39.35 for the processor benchmark, which is pretty much in line with what a DX4 should do. And I'll just fast forward a bit here so we can get the memory benchmark results. And yeah, so pretty much in line with what the cache check benchmark showed us, the main memory throughput is very low. In this benchmark, we're showing only 12.4 megabytes per second. So let's start out by seeing if we can get our memory performing better. So I'm just going to go over to the system timing page in the BIOS here. And you can see that the defaults for the DRAM is really, really bad. Like a weight state of 2 is really high. So I'm going to set this to 0. I'm also going to enable fast page mode, which is important for good performance. And I'm also going to set the sampling activity time to no delay. And we'll leave everything else at the defaults for now. But let's see if that makes any improvement. So let's start with cache check and just see what that did. And you can see right away that the memory latency values have gone down considerably. Before they were about 115, now they're around 48 to 51, somewhere in that range. So less than half, really, really good. And the main memory speed also increased from less than 10 megs per second to over 21. So I think that's a really huge improvement. The memory is performing a lot better now. And let's see how that faster memory impacts a real-world game here like Doom. So Doom definitely does benefit from faster memory, and we can see that the score went from about 27 to 31, so about 4 frames per second. Not huge, but not insignificant either. All right, so now that we've got the memory performing well, let's do the same thing for the cache memory. So we want to also reduce the timings. The defaults are the loosest you can get, so I'm going to go to 2111, and I'm going to get rid of the wait state for write, but I'm also going to enable write back mode for the L2 cache instead of write through. It should give us some better performance as well. So let's see what kind of impact that has. So once again, we'll go to cache check just to see what kind of impact that had. And you can see that the L2 latency went down quite a bit, but also the main memory latency. And a lot of that had to do with the write back mode for L2 cache. And you can see the L2 cache throughput too is much higher now at 55.8 megs per second. And the main memory speed has also gone up considerably all the way up to 34.4. And in Doom that equated to about 3 frames per second, so from 31 to 34.2, not bad. So let's see if there's anything else we can do to squeeze some performance out of this system. So the PowerGraph C33 card I have for this build is based on the very fast Western Digital WD90 C33 chip. It's also sometimes just called the WD Paradise. So when I first got it, I wasn't all that impressed by the performance, to be perfectly honest. It did a little better than most cards, but really wasn't any faster than the Cirrus Logic cards I had. I wasn't sure if it was something about my system that was holding it back or what the problem was, but after part 1 of the video series came out, Linear on Twitter recognized the PowerGraph card and mentioned that there were some super secret undocumented jumpers that can be used for getting better performance from the card. So this obviously got me very excited, and after doing some digging, I was able to identify them. So there's a bank of 3 jumpers labeled JP2 on the card, and the first 2 are of interest, pins 1 and 2 and pins 3 and 4. So the default position is 1 and 2 closed and 2 and 3 open. And basically you just want to reverse those positions, and that'll set the card to 0 wait states, and it really unleashes the full potential of what the card's capable of. So the big question is whether or not the card can handle this at a 40 megahertz bus speed, so we'll find out. I've seen these types of jumpers before, and quite often they're labeled as something like 33 megahertz operation or greater than 40 megahertz operation, and they're basically intended to just slow things down to ensure stability at higher bus speeds. And because the VISA local bus runs at the full bus frequency, many cards just can't handle this unless you introduce some wait cycles. So let's see what the 0 wait state jumpers change got us here. And I can already tell it's definitely running faster. 68.3 FPS, wow, so that's like 12 FPS faster, and that's like a 20% improvement. Not insignificant at all, that's huge. So let's see if we see the same kind of gains in Doom here. And we get 40.9 FPS, so again, that's like a 20% improvement almost. Really, really impressive. So that change was done on the video card itself, but the motherboard also supports some wait states for VLB to help with stability at higher frequencies. And this can be set with some jumpers on the board, but in my case they're already set for 0 wait states and as quick as they can go. There is, however, a setting called local ready delay that can be set in the BIOS. And again, this was intended to improve stability with some cards. But let's change it from its default of 1T to none and see if we can't squeeze a little bit more out of this card. So the improvement is much smaller, but still measurable, less than 1 frame per second in 3D Bench. And in Doom, we get about a 1 frame per second improvement. So not dramatic, but definitely an improvement, and I'll take it. All right, so we ran quite a few benchmarks here, so let's just put them in chart form. It's a lot easier to take a look at. And here you can see that every time we made an improvement, whether it be to the memory, to the cache, or even to the VGA card in the system, we saw pretty substantial increases. So all the way from 27.2 up to 41.9 frames per second in Doom when we were done with the tweaking. And that's like a 30+% improvement, which is just unheard of in modern systems. And you got to remember too that this is without doing any overclocking whatsoever. We're literally just, tweaking timings and wait states and things like that. So a lot of extra potential for performance compared to, what you see these days. And, we saw the same sort of thing in 3D Bench as well, from 49.9 all the way up to 68.7. So that's almost 20 frames per second. So looking at the synthetic CPU benchmarks, we didn't really see very much of an improvement when we did the memory tweaks. Actually, we saw no improvement at all, and that's because those benchmarks, just memory really doesn't have any bearing on it at all with the way that the benchmark works. But when we did do the cache tweaks, we saw pretty huge improvements in the system information CPU benchmark and a small improvement in the SpeedSys CPU benchmark as well. And taking a look at the SpeedSys memory bandwidth figures, we can see some really huge improvements here, especially in main memory. We went all the way from 12.4 megabytes per second up to 27.1. That's more than double. And the L2 cache as well, we went from 27.1 to 40.5 for about a 50% improvement, so really huge. And taking a look at cache check, we see a lot of the same sort of patterns, just sort of in reverse because a lower score is better here. But the main memory, we went all the way from 114.3 down to 30.5 when we were done our tweaking. The memory tweaks that we did, the wait states and stuff, did help quite a bit, as well as enabling fast page mode. But once we introduced the cache tweaks as well, turning on write back mode, that's when the system really started to shine here. All right, so now that the system's performing well, it's time to start swapping out CPUs. So I'm going to leave all the BIOS settings as is. The only exception will be for the DX280, which will need a higher AT clock divider to keep the ISA bus at 8 MHz. I'm not going to make you watch a ton of benchmark runs again, so we'll just jump straight to the results in chart form. All right, so here's the results for 3D Bench and Doom, and all these chips really ran Doom quite well, with only the DX266 getting a little bit choppy sometimes. An interesting observation here is that after doing the memory cache and VGA tweaks, the DX266 actually outperformed the DX4100 with everything left at its defaults. And that's from a CPU that's a full 33 MHz slower and has half the L1 cache. So it just sort of shows how important it is to try and tune these old systems. You'll also notice that there's quite a gap between the DX4 from Cyrix and Intel on the chart here. So the Cyrix 486s are a bit slower clock for clock compared to Intel and AMD chips. And the larger 16K L1 of the Intel chip is probably also playing a role here, so that's a little bit expected. One of the biggest stars on this chart, though, is really the DX280. And despite being clocked 20 MHz slower, it almost matched the Cyrix DX4 and 3D Bench, and it actually outperformed it by a healthy margin in Doom. And this is really all thanks to the 40 MHz frontside bus and the faster RAM L2 cache and the faster VESA local bus that all comes with that. And despite there only being about a 14 MHz delta between it and the DX266, it really is significantly faster when it comes to gaming performance. So the synthetic CPU benchmarks are somewhat, predictable here, I think. Especially SpeedSys, we see a nice linear increase as the CPU frequency goes up. More surprising is the system information CPU benchmark, especially between the Cyrix DX4 and the DX280, with the DX280 actually coming out ahead a little bit. And I think that's because L2 cache performance does play a role in that benchmark, so it's a little bit higher because of the higher bus speed. The other interesting thing, and I actually pulled the CPU out and repeated this test because I thought there must have been some mistake between the 5x86 P75 and the DX4 from Intel. I don't know why, but they both score exactly the same in the system information CPU benchmark, which was kind of surprising. I thought I had the numbers mixed up somehow, but nope, that really is the way it scores. So when it comes to memory bandwidth, the AMD DX280 is on top here. And again, that's because of the 40 MHz frontside bus, which provides a lot faster main memory and L2 cache. The L1 cache is still faster on the Am5x86, which is expected because it runs at the full processor frequency and it's a lot faster there. Unfortunately, I couldn't get data for the Cyrix 486 because the way the SpeedSys and check cache work is it tries to figure out how much L1 and L2 you have based on speed differences. And with the Cyrix, for some reason, the L1 and L2 cache perform so close to each other that it can't distinguish them, and it sort of blends those numbers together as a single cache level. So it sort of would make the L1 cache look a lot slower than it really is, and the L2 cache much faster than it really is, and it's not really a fair comparison, so I've had to remove that from this chart. So when it comes to memory latency as measured by cache check, it's a bit of an interesting situation because any of the three top CPUs that you see there could be at the top of the chart depending on how I sorted the data. In the end, I just decided to sort it based on L2 cache latency. But you can see that the Am5x86 is slightly ahead. But again, the DX280 has a really strong showing here because of its faster bus speed. So both the main memory latency is very low and the L2 as well. The Cyrix chip, unfortunately, same situation here. It blended the L1 and L2 together as one single cache level because of the speed being so close between the two. Alright, so now I have to pick a CPU to use for this build. And to be honest, all 4 of these chips here would probably work just fine for my purposes, but you know, I've only got one system and I can only pick one chip. So if you were me, which one would you choose and why? Please let me know in the comments because I'd really love to hear your thoughts about this as well. So I'll just go through them one by one. The first one here is the 486 DX266 from Intel. And bottom line, it's an awesome, legendary 486, famous for gaming back in the day. And as much as I love this chip, I think I'm going to have to pass on it. It's just a little bit choppy with some of the latest DOS titles. And although I must say that, you know, with all of the tweaks that we did to this system here, it works way better than I would have expected. And it certainly seems to run faster than what I remember these doing back in the day as well. Next, we'll talk about the Cyrix DX4100. Again, performance-wise, it does pretty well, and I think it would work just fine. I'm just a little bit disappointed in the gaming performance from this, at least compared to the other chips I tested. It is a 3-volt part, so it does have that going for it. But again, I can only pick one chip, so I think I'm going to pass on this one as well. And that really leaves these two, so the Intel DX4100 and the AMD DX280. And both of these chips really exceeded my expectations, to be perfectly honest. They're both awesome performers, but at the same time, they're very different chips, and they sort of excel in different ways. So honestly, the DX4100 is really fast. It's perfect in just about every way. It's got a fast 100 megahertz clock, double the L1 that most 486s have, and it's just an excellent all-around performer. But that said, you know, as much as I just said all these great things about it, I'm going to pass. Again, the spirit of this build isn't really to build the fastest system. One of my goals was to do things a little bit differently, to build something that was, you know, a tad quirky and less conventional. And I wanted the CPU to really reflect this as well. And I think, you know, what better choice but to pick an uncommon CPU running at an uncommon bus speed, and that is the AMD DX280. I really enjoyed getting the system, you know, tweaked and tuned and working as efficiently as possible. And I just thought that, you know, using a CPU with a 40 megahertz bus just really brought out the most in everything. The L2 cache was faster, the memory, my Western Digital VLB card really came out of its shell. And I was just really pleasantly surprised I could do all of that while keeping the timings and wait states, you know, as low as possible. So the benchmark results, you know, they speak for themselves, but, you know, in real world gaming, the DX280 really feels like a significant step up from the DX266. All right, so now that the CPU's been chosen, there's just one last thing to do, and that's to do basically the complete opposite of what I've been doing so far. And that's not to speed up the system, but to slow it down as much as possible for speed-sensitive games. So basically, I just need to see if this DX280 can slow down sufficiently for a game like Wing Commander, for example, that's sort of notoriously speed-sensitive. So let's see how we do with this and if there's any additional tweaking that's needed to get there. So the original Wing Commander game for PC came out way back in 1990, and it's well known for being almost completely unplayable in anything faster than a 386. So to get the game playing just right, you need something about as quick as a 386 DX25, and you definitely don't want to go any faster than that. You can recognize the problem almost immediately during the intro scene, especially the part where the ship is being chased and then is blown up. The credits also appear and disappear very quickly, and the speed of the asteroids in the background is also way too fast. So thankfully this 486 system has a working turbo switch that can be shorted to greatly reduce the system performance for this purpose. So let's see if it's enough to get us the right amount of speed for Wing Commander. Here's what the CPU information CPU benchmark scores with the turbo pins shorted. So remember, we got about 172.9 before, and it's been reduced by a really huge margin down to only 33. So that's about an 80% decrease in CPU performance, and roughly what a 386 DX33 will get. So running Wing Commander again, we can see it's definitely better, but it is still a little bit too fast. And this is because, you know, although the CPU scored much lower and it's looking more like a 386, we've still got really fast memory and other components in the system like the VGA card. Thankfully, there's still many other ways we can slow things down further. Since I still need to reduce the performance by quite a bit, I'm going to disable the L2 cache completely in the system. And I'm also going to slow down the RAM as well by disabling fast page mode, which is something we enabled before for quite a significant performance gain. And let's see if this is enough. And now we're scoring about half what we did before, so around 15 instead of 33. And if we look at Wing Commander, we can see it now seems to be running at about the right speed. It may be just a touch slow, but it should now be possible to do some further tweaks if we want to get it just right. At any rate, I'm very happy with this, and you know, the system can definitely be slowed down enough to play games like this, which is awesome. All right, so that's it for today. It was quite a bit of work doing all the tuning and benchmarking with the various CPUs, but I also think it was very necessary to put the system through its paces and to see exactly what it was capable of. In the end, I'm really happy with how the system works and performs, and I think I'm now ready to finally get it built. So stay tuned for part 3. I'll get everything put together, and we'll do some actual gaming with it, which I can't wait to do. And as always, if you'd like to see more retro content like this, please be sure to like and subscribe. Thanks again.